I came across Big Fork Brands recently, and it's become one of those finds you actually want to tell people about, and you don't find that often. Okay. They're doing bacon sausage, plus these really solid pork jerky snacks and Chicago style sauces. Basically, upgrade anything you throw them on burgers, hot dogs, fries, throw it on there. It works.
But I bet it's packed full of junk.
Actually, it's made with clean ingredients and real care. That's small batch with no shortcuts, and people are obsessed with the flavor. You can go over to bigforkbrands.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout, and get 20% off anything on the site.
You can find the link and our code in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William,
And I'm Kat,
and that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity wherever you go.
So, this idea came from, I don't even know where this came from. It just showed up on our shopping list, kind of did some research into it. And, basically, I guess we're going to get into exactly what it is and all of that. But what the ancient obsession with death and power and skulls, right? Have you ever heard of it called a skull cult, though?
No, but broadly it makes sense, I guess, if you're just kind of like looking outside of a
Yeah.
very large lens.
A
I,
very large lens, yes.
part of me imagines like people with skulls on sticks dancing around a fire, and then the other part kind of thinks about the was it the black cauldron?
Or the skull and bones. I guess maybe like a cult that just like, hey, let's just have a skull as our thing. This is what we're gonna follow.
Yeah,
Or maybe Shakespeare and Hamlet. I don't know.
mm, Cloth the Raven.
Ah, here we go. All right, so let me see if I can set this up. So, the universal object of fear, right? There's a moment deep inside a cave or ancient shelter where the darkness feels less like emptiness and more like presence. Torchlight breaks through it unevenly, revealing stone walls shaped by time, water, and human hands long gone. And then you see it, a human skull.
It is not hidden. It is not discarded. It has been placed deliberately on a flat surface as if its position matters. It faces outward, toward the open space of the cave, as though it's still part of the room rather than something removed from life. The bone is aged, discolored by time, marked by fractures that came long after death. But what stands out most is not its condition, it is the fact that it is there at all, separated from the rest of the body, treated differently from every other bone.
Around it, there are signs of intention, a cleared space, possibly other remains arranged nearby, maybe carvings in the stone, maybe nothing obvious at all, except the sense that this is not random. This is what was done on purpose for a reason that once mattered deeply to the people who stood here. Now, let's step back from this for a moment because this scene's not really unique.
Across continents and across thousands of years, long before modern communication, long before cultures had any knowledge of each other's existence, humans who never met, never shared a language, and never shared a belief system all arrived at the same behavior. They kept the skulls of the dead.
In burial sites, in temples, in caves, in shrines, and in places of ritual significance. The same pattern appears again and again. Different environments, different civilizations, different understandings of the world. But the same object is singled out repeatedly from the human body and treated with meaning, the skull. And that raises a question that sits at the center of this entire story.
Why the skull? Why does this one part of the human body, more than any other bone, more than any other remains, appear again and again in ritual, in religion, in symbolism, even in fear? Is it because it looks like us, even after everything else is gone? Is it because it's the last physical trace of identity once the person is no longer alive? Or is it because, on some deeper level, the skull represents something humans have been trying to understand since the earliest moments of consciousness itself? What it means for a mind to exist and then disappear. Now, whatever the answer is, it's not confined to one culture or one time period. And that's really where this story begins.
I guess now let's define what exactly a skull cult is. So before we go any further, I think it's very important that we clear up a common misunderstanding about the phrase because this is not a single organization, not a hidden society operating through history, not a conspiracy theory, and not one continuous belief system passed down in secret. Instead, what historians and anthropologists are already looking at is a pattern, one that appears independently across cultures, separated by time, geography, and language.
A skull cult, in the broadest academic sense, refers to the reverence, ritual use, or symbolic power assigned to human skulls in different societies. It's less about one unified group and more about a reoccurring human behavior. The decision to treat the skull as something more than ordinary remains. When you start comparing these traditions, they tend to fall into three broad categories. The first is ancestor veneration. In these practices, skulls are preserved and treated as a physical connection to the dead. The skull is not just what remains after death, it becomes a focal point for memory, identity, and ongoing relationships with those who have passed. In some cases, it's believed that the presence of the skull keeps the ancestors spiritually present within the community.
And then the second category is ritual power objects. Here, the skull is used within ceremonies, religious practices, or systems of authority. It may represent transformation, spiritual insight, or a connection to forces beyond the living world. In these contexts, the skull is not simply remembered, it is activated as a symbol, sometimes handled, displayed, or incorporated into, well, ritual space as a tool of meaning and control.
The third category is war trophies and intimidation symbols.
And this is what you were thinking about skulls on sticks.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
In this form, skulls are not about remembrance or spirituality in a peaceful sense, but about power. They're used to demonstrate conquest, establish dominance, or send a message of fear. The skull becomes evidence of victory and a warning to others.
What ties all of these together is not a single religion or ideology, but a shared human tendency to assign meaning to the remains of the dead, especially the skull, which so clearly preserves the structure of identity even after life has ended.
We're not talking about one secret tradition moving through history in disguise. We're looking at global anthropology, different cultures arriving at similar conclusions for different reasons. At its core, it's not just about ritual, it's about psychology, memory, and survival. It is about how humans process death and how they construct meaning from it, and how the physical remains of a person can become something far larger than biology alone. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more interesting. Where did this begin?
So this has prehistoric roots. Be- so we'll get into the first skull rituals. Long before written language, long before cities, and long before religion took, well, recognizable form, there is evidence that early humans were already treating the dead in ways that went beyond simple disposal.
In archaeological sites from the Neolithic period and even earlier, one pattern appears repeatedly: skulls separated from the rest of the body. In some burials, the skeleton is incomplete, with the skull carefully removed and placed elsewhere. In others, skulls are found grouped together in deliberate arrangements, suggesting they were collected and stored over time than rather than left with individual graves.
There are also cases where skulls appear to have been modified. Some were painted, often with mineral pigments like ochre. Others were, well, they were shaped or reinforced, suggesting that they were not only preserved but actively maintained. In certain sites, skulls are found in clusters, cached together in very direct locations that appear to have had ongoing ritual significance rather than being just simple burial grounds.
Taken together, these patterns suggest behavior that goes beyond practicality. These were not accidental remains or random disturbance. They point toward intention. Now, the question is what that intention meant.
One interpretation is that these skulls were connected to early forms of ancestor worship in small communities where survival depended heavily on memory, lineage, and shared identity. Preserving the skull may have been a way of preserving the presence of the individual. The skull becomes a focal point, though, something that anchors the memory of a person in physical space even after the body is long gone.
Another possibility is that this reflects an early concept of personhood after death. The skull, more than any other part of the body, contains the face. Even in death, it preserves a recognizable structure of identity. For early humans trying to understand what happens when someone dies, the skull may have represented the closest thing to a continuing self, a physical object, if you will, that still looked like the person who once lived.
But beyond interpretation, there is also something more human in this pattern, a sense of trying to hold on to what cannot be held, to preserve a presence that is slipping away, uh, to keep something visible when everything else has disappeared. And in that sense, these skulls are not just archaeological objects, they are emotional artifacts. And artifacts. They are emotional artifacts, evidence of early humans struggling with absence, memory, and just the final death as at its core.
Mm-hmm. This is very adjacent to an urn on a mantle.
Yeah, I would say so.
And over time, that simple act of remembrance begins to change. Because once a skull is preserved, once it is kept, once it is separated from the body and given attention beyond burial, its meaning starts to shift. It's no longer just what remains of a person, it becomes something more, something that can be used, interpreted, or even controlled. And that's where remembrance begins to turn into ritual power.
Across later civilizations, the meaning of the skull becomes more complex, more structured, and in some cases, far more visible in public life. What begins as a scattered ritual practice in early human history it evolved into a highly developed symbolic system. Each culture interpreting the skull through, its own understanding of life, death, and the divine.
In Mesoamerica, particularly within Aztec and Maya influenced traditions, the skull takes on a central role in religious cosmology. It's not treated simply as a reminder of death, but as part of a continuous cycle between life, death, and rebirth. Death is not an ending in the same sense it is in many modern interpretations. It's the transition within a larger cosmic structure.
One of the most striking expressions of this is Zompantli, or skull rack. These were large, organized displays of human skulls, and they were often placed in or near ceremonial centers. They were not hidden away, they were visible, structured, and integrated into the physical and spiritual landscape of the society. Within this worldview, such displays were tied to ritual sacrifice and religious cosmology acts that, embedded in the maintenance of cosmic order or rather than random violence.
Skulls also appear frequently in Mesoamerican art and temple architecture, reinforcing their role as symbols of transformation and continuity rather than simple death. They're a part of a visual language that connects human morality to the movement of time, gods, and the universe itself.
Moving to ancient Europe, the interpretation of skulls, it shifts again among some Celtic societies. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that skulls were sometimes preserved as war trophies, taken as symbols of victory and power. In other contexts, they may have held more spiritual or ritual significance, though interpretations vary widely depending on region and, time period.
As we move into the Greco Roman world, skull symbolism becomes less about physical preservation and more about philosophical reflection. The skull begins to appear as a representation of morality itself. Life is celebrated, but death is always present in thought and art as an unavoidable conclusion. This is where early forms of memento mori thinking began to emerge. The idea that awareness of death is essential to understanding life. The skull becomes less an object of ritual and more a reminder. All human achievement is temporary. If you don't know what memento mori is, it means remember you must die in Latin.
So, in the Tibetan and Himalayan regions, skull symbolism, well, takes on yet another meaning with certain strands of tantric practice. Here, skulls, often in the form of ritual cups known as kepla, are used in ceremonial and meditative contexts, unlike the European focus on mortality or the Mesoamerican emphasis on cosmology cycles. These practices often frame the skull as a symbol of transformation. Death is not simply an end or a transition, but a gateway through which perception itself can be altered, leading towards spiritual insight or enlightenment.
Across all these regions, one pattern becomes increasingly clear. The skull is never just a skull. It's a memory in Mesoamerica, where it's woven into the structure of the cosmos. It's power and identity in parts of ancient Europe, where it can represent conquest or warning. It's a reflection of the Greco Roman world, where it becomes a philosophical anchor for understanding mortality. And it is transformation in Himalayan ritual texts, where it becomes part of a spiritual path beyond ordinary perception.
So, different worlds, different beliefs, different meanings, but the same object repeatedly pulled into the center of, well, human thought. And with each civilization, the skull moves a little further away from being just a physical remains and a little closer to becoming a symbol. And I say before we get into the unhinged medieval time, I say let's take a small break.
Sounds good to me.
All right.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Have you thought about what you're getting your mom for Mother's Day? At Cozy Earth, they have a full line of apparel, PJs, shirts, socks, you name it, they have it. And if you buy any of their bedding, they have a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty, free shipping on orders over $50 or more. And our listeners get an exclusive discount of 21% off just by using our code INFOGO at checkout. And you can do that at cozyearth.com. Find the link and the code in the show notes. If you're laying mulch, bedding animals, covering seeds, or just want your property looking right, there's one name you need to know. Irwin Farms, Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. When it comes to quality wheat straw, it matters. Clean, consistent, and ready to work because they don't cut corners, they bale it. Whether you're a homeowner, gardener, farmer, or you're just getting your hands dirty for the first time, they've got you covered. You can find a link in the show notes. Just Google Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. Either way, you'll find Irwin Farms.
Now that we're back, in medieval and early modern Europe, the meaning of the skull shifts again. This time away from ritual use or symbolic power in a physical sense, and towards something more reflective, more personal, and often more moral in tone. Now, this is where the tradition of memento mori comes in.
The phrase itself means remember you will die, and it becomes a central theme in European art, religious teachings, and burial culture. The skull is no longer an object placed in ritual space or used in ceremony. Instead, it becomes a visual reminder embedded into everyday life, paintings, church carvings, tomb structures, tomb sculptures, and personal devotional objects.
You start to see skulls appearing at the feet of saints in religious artwork. You see them carved into stone markers in cemeteries. You see them painted beside hourglasses, wilted flowers, and extinguished candles, which are all symbols pointing to the same truth. Time is passing, and life is temporary.
You know, that makes perfect sense because I have always wondered. When you see those medieval paintings or carvings, you often see the skull.
Hmm.
It makes perfect sense now. But the skull is not something to be feared in a supernatural sense. It is something to be understood, a fixed image that interprets ordinary life with a moment of clarity. Wealth, status, power, and beauty are all shown beside it, not to glorify death, but to diminish the illusion that any of these things can last.
This shift becomes even more pronounced during periods of mass mortality, especially during plague outbreaks in Europe. As waves of disease move through cities and villages, death becomes a constant, visible reality rather than a distant concept. Burial grounds expand, mortality becomes part of daily life, and in this environment, skull imagery grows more common and more direct.
That too makes perfect sense too.
Hmm.
The skull is no longer only a philosophical symbol, it becomes a reflection of lived experience. It appears in church teachings not just as an abstract reminder, but as a response to a world where death is sudden, widespread, and really unavoidable in all senses.
Religious interpretation during this period reframes the skull in a specific way. It is not an object of worship. It is not meant to be engaged with ritually in the way earlier cultures might have done. Instead, it becomes a moral teaching tool, a way to guide behavior, a visual warning that earthly life is temporary, and that spiritual life should be prioritized over material attachment.
In this context, well, the skull itself serves a purpose. It brings mortality into focus so that life can be lived differently in response to it. What changes here is not the presence of the skull, but its function. It moves from being something handled or integrated into ritual systems to something observed, reflected upon, and internalized. As Europe moves forward, well, that reflective symbolism begins to spread and evolve once again. This time, it takes on a new form of belief, new organizations, and new fears about what hidden meanings the skull might still hold.
As Europe moves into the early modern period, skull imagery begins to leave the church walls and cemetery art where it was once most common, and instead enters a far more ambiguous state. The world of secret knowledge, symbolic systems, and closed societies. Now, this is where skull symbolism becomes closely associated with alchemy, occult traditions, and fraternal orders.
In the alchemy text and illustrations, the skull often appears not as a literal object of worship, but as a coded symbol. Alchemy itself is not just about turning base metals into gold in a physical sense. It is also, well, framed as a metaphor for inner transformation. Within that framework, the skull represents the end of one state of being and the beginning of another. In this context, the skull is tied to initiation.
Now, to encounter the skull symbolically is to confront mortality directly, not as an external idea, but as something internal and unavoidable. It represents the death of the old self, ignorance, ego, and previous identity. What follows is not physical death, but transformation. The initiate is meant to emerge changed, refined, and in some interpretations, enlightened.
This symbolic logic carries into various fraternal and initiatory societies that developed across Europe during this period. So within these groups, the skull, well, the image is often used in controlled, ritualized settings to represent thresholds, moments where a person's symbolically crosses from one stage of understanding or belonging into another.
In most of these contexts, the skull is not an object of literal worship. It's not being venerated as a physical relic or treated as a supernatural focus in the way some earlier or non European traditions might have engaged with human remains. Instead, it functions primarily as a symbol, a visual shorthand for mortality, transformation, and the seriousness of initiation.
However, outside these closed systems, the meaning of these symbols often becomes, well, distorted. As skull imagery becomes more visible in esoteric text, ritual descriptions, and rumors surrounding secret societies, it also becomes a source of public fascination and suspicion. The lack of transparency around these groups, well, it does allow the imagination to fill in the gaps. Symbols that were meant to represent internal transformation are well, reinterpreted as evidence of hidden power, structures, or forbidden knowledge.
Now, this is where mythology begins to grow. Stories about secret societies become exaggerated. Symbols are taken out of context. The skull, already a powerful image associated with death and transition, becomes even more charged when linked to ideas of secrecy and initiation. It begins to carry not just meaning, but mystery and sometimes fear.
What was once a reminder of mortality in public religious life becomes, well, the newer interpretations, a sign of something hidden beneath the surface of society itself. And that shift sets the stage for how skull symbolism continues to evolve into the modern world, where archaeology, science, pop culture, and conspiracy all kind of began to compete over what these symbols actually mean. It's aliens.
Ooh. Anyway, as modern archaeology develops into a scientific discipline, it begins to fundamentally change how skulls in ancient contexts were understood. Understood?
Understood? Just keep going. We'll leave it in.
Oh my goodness. What earlier generations might have interpreted as evidence or cult activity or hidden ritual horror is now examined through a different lens. One grounded in cultural practice, anthropology, and historical context. Skulls deposit burial arrangements, and ritualized remains are increasingly understood not as evidence of something sinister or universal, but as expressions of specific societies responding to death in ways that made sense within their own belief systems.
So, in other words, archaeology, well, it frames skull use as a cultural ritual, not cult horror.
A Zompantli is studied as a structured religious monument, not as a macabre mystery. Painted skulls are analyzed as part of mortuary tradition, not signs of hidden obsession. Even practices that once seemed shocking are placed into broader frameworks of meaning, where they are understood as part of complex cosmologies rather than isolated acts of violence or superstition.
But while academic interpretation moves toward clarity, public imagination often moves in the opposite direction. Outside of scholarly work, skull imagery continues to accumulate new layers of meaning, especially in pop culture and modern storytelling. Conspiracy theories and underground narratives, well, they frequently revive the idea of skull cults, not as a historical reconstruction, but as a mysterious or hidden force operating beneath society. And these interpretations often strip away the context and replace it with, well, speculation, turning archaeological evidence into symbolic proof of, well, secret power structures. At the same time, media plays a major role in reshaping the skull's image in the modern world.
In horror films, the skull is used as an immediate visual shorthand for death, danger, or the supernatural. In video games, it often appears as a symbol of enemies, cursed spaces, or high stakes transformation. In both cases, its meaning is simplified into something instantly recognizable and emotionally charged.
Beyond entertainment, skull imagery also appears in the growing phenomenon of dark tourism, places where people visit historical sites associated with death, tragedy, or mass mortality. Here, the skull is not always physically present, but its symbolism lingers in museums, memorials, a preserved burial sites that emphasize just how fragile human life is and historical violence.
Psychologically, this continued fascination raises a deeper question. Why does the skull remain so powerful across time, even when its original meanings are no longer shared or understood in the same way? One reason is recognition. The skull is one of the few parts of the human body that remains immediately identifiable, even when stripped of everything else. It is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. A structure that once held a face but no longer does.
Another reason is its direct connection to mortality. Unlike other symbols of death, the skull is not abstract. It is what remains when individuality is gone. But in its form, the skull still exists. It forces a confrontation with the reality that every living person eventually becomes something like it.
And finally, there's ambiguity. The skull does not belong to a single meaning system anymore. It has been used by religions, rituals, philosophers, artists, and modern media in completely different ways. And that accumulation of meaning makes it powerful, but also unstable, always open to reinterpretation. So even in the modern world where its historical origins are studied and explained, the skull continues to carry emotional weight that is difficult to fully remove. Because it's not just an artifact of the past, it is a symbol that keeps being rediscovered.
In the modern world, skull imagery doesn't disappear. It expands. It moves out of religious spaces, out of archaeological context, and even out of historical interpretation, and becomes something far more fluid, a visual language used across fashion, identity, and digital culture.
In fashion and branding, the skull becomes instantly recognizable. It appears on clothing, jewelry, tattoos, and album art, often stripped of any specific cultural or historical meaning. In these settings, it can signal a range of ideas depending on context, like danger, mystery, rebellion, or even a kind of stylized awareness of mortality. What once carried deep ritual or philosophical meaning is now often reduced to a strong visual impact bold, simple, and emotionally immediate.
In music culture, especially in genres that emphasize intensity or resistance, skull imagery becomes part of identity construction. It signals an attitude more than a belief system, something that communicates edge, independence, or confrontation with social norms. The skull here is less about death itself and more about what it represents emotionally. Defiance, impermanence, and intensity of experience.
In military symbolism, skulls take on a different function again. They're often used in insignia patches and unit markings as part of intimidation aesthetics. The message is not abstract, it's direct. The skull communicates danger, fearlessness, and lethal capacity. It is a symbol designed to project psychological impact both to those who wear it and those who see it.
At the same time, skull imagery becomes deeply embedded in countercultural identity. For some groups, it represents rejection of mainstream values. For others, it reflects an acceptance of mortality that stands well in contrast to consumer culture, which focuses on performance and control. In these contexts, the skull becomes a reminder of limits, of time, life, of certainty, and that awareness is transformed into identity. But perhaps the most modern shift happens online.
Now, on the internet, the World Wide Web, if you will, skull imagery becomes part of a constantly evolving system of myth making, where history, fiction, symbolism, and speculation all blur together. A single image can be reposted, reinterpreted, memed, and detached from its original context within, really, it says hours, but we all know it's seconds.
It's true.
Archaeological symbols, historical artifacts, and fictional representations can all merge into the same visual space without clear boundaries between what is real, symbolic, or invented.
So this digital environment, it accelerates something that has always been present in skull symbolism, reinterpretation. But now that reinterpretation happens at a scale and speed, often without the grounding of historical or cultural context. As a result, the skull becomes something even more unstable than before. It is no longer just a religious object, a philosophical reminder, or cultural artifact. It becomes a floating symbol, able to carry meaning in fashion, in warfare aesthetics, in subcultural identity, and in the internet mythology all at once. And in that sense, it completes a long historical arc from sacred objects to a moral reminder to secret symbols to cultural icons to digital memes. The skull has never stopped changing, but it has also never stopped being, well, recognized.
Now, you might be asking, why the skull? Right. Well, across every period we've looked at, from early burial sites to ancient civilizations to medieval Europe, esoteric traditions, all the way up to the modern world. The skull keeps reappearing. It changes meaning each time it appears, but it never disappears from human attention. And maybe that's the key.
Because the skull is not just a symbol of death in the simple sense. Death alone would not explain its persistence across cultures that had no contact with each other, no shared language, and no shared history. Something deeper is happening here.
This goal is what remains when almost everything that makes a person identifiable is gone. But not all of it. It still carries structure. It still resembles a face. And it still suggests identity even when identity itself has ended. And in that way, the skull becomes something unusual in human perception.
It is a memory made physical. It's identity reduced to its most primitive form. And it is fear given shape because it does remind us not only that death exists, but that something recognizable can remain after life is gone.
And that combination is why it never stops returning. Different cultures do not see it the same way, but they all see something in it. Some see ancestors, some see warnings, some see power, some see transformation, some see nothing more than what's left behind. But none of them ignore it. And that brings us back to the central truth of this entire story.
Every culture that ever looked at a skull saw the same truth, but not the same meaning. I found this to be really fascinating.
Absolutely.
I mean, every different culture you think of across time, you see some kind of symbolism when it comes to skulls. And I had never really heard the term skull cults before. And I thought it was something like a secret society, you know?
For sure. That's definitely where I thought this was going. But no, it makes sense. Like death is one of the biggest mysteries of life next to how we sleep and are so close to death and don't actually die. You know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I found it fascinating that cultures that had never even had contact with one another still have symbolism in the same object, just
Right.
different meanings, but the same object is being symbolized.
Yeah. And it makes sense. In my mind, it makes sense just because of it's natural for humans to be curious. It's normal for us to question things. It's normal for us to grieve and hold on to things even when we know they're not coming back, just as a sense of closure.
Absolutely. That's pretty much all I've got. I mean, unless you got anything else you want to add.
Nope, I'm good. If you would like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
If you would like to help us keep the show going, you can do so by snagging some of those deals from our sponsors or supporting us at Patreon. Either way, the links are in the show notes.
And as always, William and I want to thank you for listening.
Whether you've been with us from day one or just tuned in, thank you for coming along with the ride.
You can join the Facebook group and Info on the Go.
You never know what I'm going to say, do you?
No.
Over there, you can share with us your show ideas.
Or ask us a question.
But whatever you do, stop and hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
You can also send us a text using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
Leaving that review really does help others find us. But you can also email Kat and I directly at
infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
and you can find all of that in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.
If your stomach's been off lately, like bloating, reflux, or just not feeling right, there's a simpler way to get back on track.
With Professor B's Digestive Aid, which is an all natural blend of pure honey and ancient apitherapy, a herb rooted in Roman tradition. You know how at least they had some things right, right? It's designed to gently support and balance your digestion.
No long ingredient list, no harsh additives, just two powerful, time tested ingredients working together. It's even the same formula used to help cancer patients manage digestive discomfort.
And right now, you can get an exclusive 10% off any product. Just use our code INFOGO at checkout.